Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be looking at episodes 7 through 9 of Arcane. Of the 3 deep dives that I've done for this, I have a feeling that this one is going to end up being the most chaotic, as it has, for me, some of my absolute favorite scenes. I'm going to start with something though that isn't maybe as notably tragic, but I think that it actually captures why this show, in my opinion, is so brilliant. How it allows for you to actually see the full arc of a character without feeling the need to bring you in too quick and then have everything be flashy and showy. It trusts you to actually take the time to get to know these characters. And I think that this is captured so incredibly well, specifically with the character of Silco and the start to finish of where we are in Act 1 versus where we are here at the end. If we look at one of the biggest differences between Silco and Vander, we recognize that Vander was not going to give up his own. And more specifically, with you so often hear Vi being called his protege, and you very much can pick up on the fact that Vander is a parental and fatherly figure to both Vi and Powder, but we really zero in on that with Vi in particular. He cares so much about doing whatever he has to do to protect them. And with the opening of the entire story, you're seeing that Vi sort of gets herself into more trouble than she can handle, and Grayson is willing to try to make a deal if only Vander can just give up the person responsible for the explosion that we see during their time in Piltover. However, Vander very notably says, I'm not going to give up one of my own, and it's not just one of his own as in one of the people of Zaun. It's specifically basically his daughter. Then to see that Silco, who preyed upon this, who used this, and even with some of his underlings up until this point, had no problem throwing in their face and bribing them or blackmailing them based off of his connections to them and their relationship with their children, because you see that with one of the characters whose son dies, which we'll get to that within this discussion. But Silco, I think, absolutely felt that he could prey upon this, what he saw as a weakness in Vander, and he did. In the first act, that is absolutely what he takes advantage of. And then segue to the end of the entire first season, and that very, I think, iconic and notable moment where he is sitting at this statue. We all know the quote, "There's nothing quite as undoing as a daughter." And you see Jinx overhears this moment. And I also want to compliment the show for continuously showing us whenever somebody brings up Jinx to Silco and they bring her up in a way that is basically portraying her in a negative light, you see the way the animators have captured this, like, something inside him that just absolutely rejects any idea of her being part of the problem or him needing to give her up. And it's really notable when everything is right at his fingertips when he's having that conversation with Jace. And he even notes the fact that Jace, he's an easy mark. He didn't even haggle. But the one thing that Jace says that gets him is like, "Oh, and I need Jinx." And you see Silco has a very obvious reaction to that, which if Jace were Mel or someone else, I think they would have really capitalized on that, but it's Jace, and we've had conversations already as to some of Jace's character. But Silco, this is his, I don't even like calling it his weakness, but it is the thing that I think really finally he has a moment of humanity. He's more than just the villain of the show. He's more than just kind of that ruthless kingpin character. He actually genuinely cares for and loves Jinx. It is ultimately pretty heartbreaking, but also the parallels of the fact that that is where Vander was when we start the season, and Vander lost his life, and then you see Silco in the end, there's almost this acceptance because he was never going to give her up. Something else that we see consistently with Silco's character, especially within this last batch of episodes, he frequently uses the word loyalty, and it's obvious not just in how he operates, but in his relationship with Jinx, that has played a very key role in defining a lot of how he values the relationships he has. You see this specifically with Savika. I think very much her having that sort of foreshadowing of, you see the knife at one point when she is having a conversation with somebody who's starting to question Silco's reign, if you will, and then later she uses that very blade to harm them, and they're having that conversation once again about loyalty. So when you see these final moments between Silco and Jinx, I think we have established that Jinx, over the course of the story, so badly just wants to prove herself, to feel like she belongs, to feel like somebody cares about her, and she just wants somebody to validate that in her. And Vi was given an impossible task of becoming basically a parental figure at far too young of an age. It is not fair that she was placed in those circumstances, but she tried to do what she could, but she also did at times make mistakes, and she had to both fulfill the role of being an older sister and of being basically a parent, and she did end up falling short, because that's not anything any one child should be expected to do or to be expected to succeed in. But once she was pulled away from Jinx, we talked about so much in the first act how very much Jinx is looking to someone to help her understand how to process things. And once Vi is pulled away from her, then I think I described it as she essentially sort of imprints onto Silco. So this idea of loyalty then becomes how Jinx views what it means to actually care about somebody. And because Silco sort of stood by that until the end, and you see the way in which there wasn't really anything Jinx could do that would ruin that. He loved her, and in a moment where he should be angry, in a moment where he should, maybe you would expect, have some bitterness, as he's literally dying, you see him be his most vulnerable, his sweetest even, and he tells her that she is perfect. That's kind of like the final culmination of all of their interactions and what it means for her to be loved. That is the kind of love that she has received from him. And I think with that concept in mind, we look back at how she responded to Vi when Vi finally came back, and as an extension, how she responded to Caitlyn. And I think when you juxtapose that to her expectations that she developed based off of Silco's love, it actually makes a lot of sense. I think that initially, watching through it, you see the way that she almost has this feeling of being threatened by Caitlyn. I mean, you do hear her say things like that Enforcer, but I don't know that Jinx necessarily hates the Enforcers the same way that Vi hated the Enforcers. I think it's more so like, but Vi hates Enforcers, and also they're like that distant group of people that we understand to be enemies. Also, Silco doesn't really care for them. So I don't think she is hating Caitlyn from the viewpoint simply of she's an enforcer. Initially, I think there's also this idea of, well, she just doesn't quite have a firm grasp on reality. She is hearing what Civica is saying, and she's hearing things that Silco says, and she's hearing rumors, and so she's getting all of these things muddied in her mind, and she's just not able to differentiate. I think it's easy to look at that and just decide that it's that simple. But I think in actuality, there's a deeper reason for why she views Caitlyn the way she does. And I think a big part of it is that Silco loved her truly unconditionally. There wasn't anything that really she could do that would disrupt that feeling. However, Vi, a number of times, I think, approaches Jinx in a realistic way, in the way that somebody would if they are a caring sibling. Because she's not this all or nothing, quite in the same way that Silco is, anytime she shows any care for someone that Jinx views in even somewhat of a threatening way, it's, once again, that all or nothing. It's that you are telling me you care about me, but you obviously don't because you're choosing her. And she keeps kind of seeing glimpses of Caitlyn in this way that is a lot more monstrous than Caitlyn actually is. And in these final moments of the entirety of the season, when she puts this decision in front of Vi of, okay, well, here she is, so me or her, Vi understandably is kind of like, you're both people. Meanwhile, Silco, in the end, he basically gave up all of Zaun and all of his dreams and everything, this ideal that he was working toward. None of that really mattered when it came down to it. So he already made that decision. And yet Vi, it seems like her decision at the end of the day is simpler and easier. And I think this moment really defines how Jinx was actually internalizing what it means to be chosen and what it means to be cared for and loved. Specific scenes that showcase this, of course, there is the reunion when Caitlyn does show up. You know, at first there's this, okay, come on, Jinx, this is what Vi is saying, like, we can just go, I'm here, everything's gonna be okay. And then you see Caitlyn, and there are these thoughts that are seeping in, and she's trying to piece together or work through why she has these conflicting ideas of what's the truth, what's real, who is this person, can I trust Vi? Then when you see the bridge scene, and there's a number of really notable bridge scenes throughout this, not just this batch, but throughout the entirety, I'd say, of the show, but there's the very notable fight between Echo and Jinx, which we will get to if I can manage to talk through that scene because it is so devastating. But leading up to that fight, you actually see Vi is going to turn back and is going to try to find Jinx. That is her goal, is by Caitlyn, I'm going to go find my sister. And Caitlyn is on her way with Echo to try and deliver the Hex gem back to them. And it's also hopefully going to be this, you know, this decision made in good faith that we're turning this back over to you, and also it would allow the Firelights to kind of clear their name. During this moment, there is this attack, and Vi turns around and goes back to Caitlyn, which already, because we know that Jinx is watching this all happen, I think most people would look at this and be like, oh, she heard something and she just wants to make sure everybody's okay. But I think Jinx is witnessing, like, oh, look how easy it is for her to turn around and choose her. And then when Vi is helping her, there is this look of betrayal, like, how could you go back for her? Why would you care about her? And I think at this point, Vi is just trying to make sense of what's going on. Jinx is shooting at them. Vi has no idea of the full extent of what is transpiring internally with Jinx, but Jinx is viewing all of this as, you are choosing her over me. You don't love me, because it really is just 0 or 100%. It's all or nothing. And then we get the fight scene. This scene, oh my gosh. So I have the music from this scene. I mean, I have the soundtrack from the show that I listen to, but this particular piece of music, every time it comes on, I often listen to it while I'm, like, working out or something, and every time it comes on, I'm like, don't start crying. Don't start crying on the treadmill around strangers. Don't do it. Especially because, could you imagine if somebody's like, what is she listening to? And then they hear this piece of music that plays in this scene, and they don't know the context. They'd be like, why is this emotional for her? But it just I start immediately seeing them as little kids, and I can't handle it every time this scene, because I've watched this show multiple times, every time this scene gets me. Just seeing also this idea of what Jinx could have been, because I think in a lot of ways, had Silco not sort of taken her under his wing, if she could have somehow had a place within the Firelights, I think that we would have seen so much of what makes Jinx amazing. We would have seen it really utilized for good within the Firelights. I talked about in Act 1 how I feel like there is a parallel in how Powder is a little girl and little man, Echo, when he's a little boy. They're both very creative. They're both very innovative. Your introductions to them, you see them, like, they like to tinker with things, and they like to fix things, and they try to make things work. And they also have a curiosity, and they're constantly listening in on things, and they just want to be a part of things. There are so many similarities to them in their personalities and what they're capable of, but this is a great example of their circumstances really impacting them. Echo has gone in a direction of taking his pain and trying to ensure that others do not have to experience this, that he can lessen that pain, and that he can help them have a brighter future. There's a fantastic quote about, it's not enough to just give people what they need to survive, you need to give them enough that they can live. And this is sort of the thing that Echo lives by. Meanwhile, Jinx is in an entirely different place. But to sort of draw back from their origins and where they started by representing them as children and seeing that innocence in them before versus where they are now and what has come of them, obviously. But also, it is a very artistic decision. It really does something that most of us want within action scenes, which is a reason to care. Action for action's sake, it can be fun. Sometimes it's cool to just have the visuals and to feel the kind of surface level of, yeah, I kind of like get 'em, that feeling that you get in certain action scenes. But what I think a lot of us crave is to feel like the scene matters, and when you can additionally feel like you don't know what you want the outcome of the fight to be, that, I think, is a very difficult thing to accomplish. And not only does this accomplish it very well, but it does it in a very artistic way that is so impactful. And interestingly, it's not even that much actual action, because you see the way in which it sort of plays out before it happens. You see it as little children, and it is like a play fight. And then all of a sudden it goes to present day, the music cuts, it's primarily just the rawness of the sounds, it's the reality of this is where we are, and then it goes by very quick. And it's still one of the most notable fight scenes, if you even want to call it that. It's one of the most notable fight scenes I've ever watched. It also is exceptionally painful to watch Echo hesitate in the end. You would think it would be, of course, worse if he hadn't hesitated, but there's something about him looking at her and that recognition of, this person is my friend, they were my friend, I don't want this to be our reality. And then Jinx, I think in a way there's so many different interpretations of her reasons for why she sets off the explosion that she does. It can be a sense of she feels like she's lost everything, Vi didn't choose her, this person she knew when she was younger is fighting her, she lost, she's a failure, she once again didn't succeed. You know, you could see it as that. You could see it as this final last bit of like, I have to win, I have to prove myself, so I'm gonna do this. And obviously you see that she does end up stealing the Hex gem. I do think there's a lot of different ways to interpret this, but at the end of the day, it also just goes to show how much she doesn't really consider her own sense of safety. The whole thing is it's so emotionally gutting. Before we branch out of this series of events around this, I actually want to kind of go back just a few moments to leading up to this whole situation and talk a little bit more about Marcus. Marcus is and does maintain a level of side character categorization, you could say, throughout most of the show. But something about his final moments is very devastating, to watch him not even be able to finish the sentence of tell my daughter, and then he passes away. Talked about in Act 1 how a lot of the events that play out are a result of him indulging in corruption. And also you see a lot of the problems that have continued throughout Zaun and Piltover. He is sort of that person that is between. Very easily you can just decide, I hate this guy, which I wouldn't blame anybody for, because he is so frustrating and you just want him to make the right decision just once. But I do think there's a lot more depth to him, even in the limited time we get. The initial introduction of him, of being so condescending and belittling to the people of the Undercity, immediately plants in you this dislike of him, and I think a very justified dislike. But you see Grayson as sort of a counter to him. She's somebody who, with the limited time we get of her, she seems relatively honorable, and she seems like somebody who is willing to maybe look the other way to some degree. Not for the same reasons, though, that you see from a lot of the council and from Marcus. But you imagine as Marcus being somebody eager to prove himself, he is not really quite analyzing Grayson's behavior and her decisions for what they actually are, but rather he sees everything that Grayson is doing likely through a somewhat warped and selfish lens. If you look at the surface level of what Grayson was doing, she was willing to essentially look the other way, try to meet people from the Undercity where they were, and also maybe bend the law a little bit if it meant that we could reach some kind of conclusion to whatever was transpiring. You can, from that, decide that she was ultimately not really a very heroic or noble individual, because she's somewhat bending the laws, and she's doing so under her own morality and her jurisdiction. However, I think because you do see some crossover between her interacting with people from Piltover versus interacting with people from the Undercity, you recognize that she just silently watches and observes that Jace, as somebody who was in possession of illegal goods, there were people to speak on his behalf, and you could almost say that his level of privilege sort of spoke on his behalf for him, which allowed the laws to sort of work in his favor. Meanwhile, you are seeing laws work so against the people of the Undercity, and I think Grayson is somebody who values justice, and she's wanting to ensure that if we're willing to have things maybe be more flexible for the people of the upper city, then we should extend that to the people of Zaun as well. I think that's the place that she ultimately is operating from. However, you can see where Marcus might just have this idea of, we're going to bend the law, basically, and we're going to do it under our decision making. He's not really looking at the principle of it all. He's just looking at the idea that I'm an enforcer and I get to do whatever I want. Even Grayson does whatever she wants. And in doing this, he makes this deal with Silco, a deal that he will later come to very much regret. But you do see later on, when he is in the cemetery and he sees Grayson's statue, that there is sort of this understanding of, I strayed very much. I didn't recognize just how noble of a heart that you actually had. And then you are seeing how he is consistently stuck in this place, and he wants to get back to that path, especially for the sake of his daughter, who I think he absolutely did truly love. I think the scene where Silco is threatening him and he's playing with Marcus's daughter is one of the most terrifying scenes. Really, again, just goes back to the idea that Silco has no problem preying off of what he sees a weakness in other people, and that's their love and devotion to their children. But regardless, he very much cares about his daughter. He wants to do better. And he just is not sure how to go about it because he is so trapped and tangled within this web that Silco has placed him within. You see him fantasize about ending it all and finally ruining Silco. You see him wrestling with the idea of having the Firelights take the blame for the things that Jinx has done and the acts that she has committed. And at the end of the day, though, he loves his daughter. And so he's consistently just going to do whatever he has to do to keep her safe, which does cause a lot of issues for our other characters. But I think that's why when you see that he is wrestling with a lot of this and he does have regret and remorse, when you see him on the bridge, I think that is why that scene ends up having that additional layer. One last thing to note about this bridge scene before we segue into some other parts of this act. I think it is such a phenomenal detail that in the very opening of the show, there's no real dialogue. There's just this little sing-song voice of a small child, which happens to be Powder, as she is covering her eyes and trying not to look at all of the death around her. And then in this moment, walking, witnessing the level of death around her, and once again you hear this sing-song voice as she is humming. And I don't know if this is her way of unintentionally drawing from just a pure reactive place where that's sort of what she developed as a pattern when she sees something like this, something very traumatic. There's bodies everywhere. To see something like this and just immediately start humming, if it's sort of like is it Pavlov's dogs? That's the whole when you ring the bell and they start drooling because that bell they associate with food. It's like, is it something like that where it's just now ingrained in her that to see something like this, to have this scene that looks so similar to what she witnessed as a very small child, to immediately start humming? I just think there's so many different interpretations likely of why that occurs, but the very fact that they thought to put that in there is just another detail that I think is just absolutely fantastic, phenomenal. I know every chat I'm basically like, isn't Arcane amazing? But I think it is, which is why I consistently am complimenting all these details. I think they're great. Finally, jumping out of that whole situation though and getting into some things involving Jace and Victor. There is a particular scene with Victor that I was alluding to last week, and I'm not gonna jump into that just yet. We will get to it though. But you do see that Jace ordered that they close off the Undercity from Piltover. You have moments where, because Victor is currently, his health is deteriorating and he's trying to find answers and he's running out of time. He's just trying to do what he can the time that he has. He has gone down to visit the person that he knew when he was a child. You don't know too much about this person. You do hear this person mention that they had a daughter of their own. I'm very curious to see if we get more with that later on. But you also see that this individual is the one who treated Jinx after the bridge scene. Regardless, though, Victor has gone to see this mysterious person. And on his way back, Jace is upset with Victor because there's all this chaos and people upset and basically rioting. And Victor asks Jace, like, what's going on? Why are we limiting these people from coming across? And Jace is mad at Victor and he's like, do you know how it looks to have my own partner violate this order? So I've talked about before that Jace is always making decisions without looking at the big picture. He also has quite the power imbalance when it comes to him being and he even calls Victor his partner in this moment, because obviously they work on Hex Tech together. He never includes people in on his decisions unless he's already been manipulated by them, in which case he is sort of, as a result, working with them. But when he decides on something, he forgets that Victor is somebody who should have a say. So we saw this previously when he decided in the moment when he's on stage that he wasn't going to announce their work to all of the people on Progress Day. And obviously Victor was somebody who he had talked with about, you know what, we're not going to do what Heimerdinger said. We're going to go ahead and go through with this. And then he changed his mind. Then here he makes this decision. Obviously he has power now on the council that Victor doesn't have. However, he didn't even let Victor know, and then turns around and gets mad at Victor for going against the thing that he put in place. And you also see him say, it's hard to believe what they're capable of. And I will admit, I felt such satisfaction when Victor smacks his hand and he's like, I'm from the Undercity. And I'm just like, because I just really needed somebody to put Jace in his place, and I love that moment. And I understand that Jace is under a lot of pressure, but also he doesn't know what he's doing, right? We know this. He doesn't know. He's not good at looking past what's right in front of him. And he also doesn't really think all the time before he speaks, which is why he says these things to what is supposed to be his best friend, not even realizing that he's insulting his best friend. But just the fact that he gets mad at Victor and he's like, do you know how this looks? Basically, for me to have my partner violate the rule that I put in place. Don't you know how bad this looks for me? And I'm like, buddy, you make yourself look bad all by yourself. Victor is not responsible for your presentation of idiocy. But regardless, that scene is very sad because you're seeing Victor having to be belittled by Jace. I mean, Jace is a very apologetic and he's like, I'm sorry, that's not what I meant. That's not how, okay, come on, let's go. It makes me continuously very sad. It's what I was saying from the very beginning in Act 1, where there's just so much potential for these two to really, truly see each other and to be such great friends. But then I think through their circumstances, through the fact that they had very different lives growing up, through the way that they're treated very different by the people around them. So often they end up talking over each other or past each other. And I think that this scene is sort of like all of that finally sort of having that breaking point. We do get a scene later, though, where you're sort of having them come back together, and it is after Sky has died and Victor doesn't know what to do with her ashes, and he's getting ready to pour them out, and also he's contemplating his own life at this point. And you see him and Jace have a conversation, and I do think, once again, sort of tying back to the way in which this show has done such a great job of having arcs well done within this first season. I talked about that so much with Silco versus Vander. Here you saw where they started, so hopeful of what Hex Tech could be. And then you have this moment where they're realizing they've created weapons. They appealed to the council. They wanted more. They wanted more opportunities. They wanted to create more. They wanted to appease more. In Jace's instance, he, I think, did get a little caught up in the fanfare. Likely a lot of people who watch this show take note of what Victor says in this moment, where he articulates that in the pursuit of great, we failed to do good. I think that this is sort of a tragedy for their arc to end in this moment, where they were so filled with hope. There was so much that they were thinking they could do together. And then we're at this point, years later, only for them to realize that they really have accomplished what feels like nothing. They were able to create technological advancements, but what's been done with those things, what's really changed, whose lives are better, I think that's very well realized in this moment for both of them. Since we're on the topic of Victor, though, I think we should finally get around to talking about what is probably one of the most emotional scenes ever, and that is when he runs. Oh, just like the scene with Jinx and Echo, I think that I can't talk about this scene. I'm so sorry. I mean, I can. I will. This is the scene that I did end up doing a scene analysis for, and I was comparing it to when he was a small boy. And you see that moment when he's a boy and he's creating the boat, and how as it is going down the water, he's trying to keep up with it. And I mentioned last week that I think in a way the boat is representing what his mind is capable of, and then there's the physical representation of him not being able to be caught up with it, and just how devastating that moment is. Fast forward to now, and that moment too of hesitation, of him just sort of standing there and taking it all in and taking in the breath, and it almost kind of being this slow motion feeling, very quiet, and then him taking that step, and then him getting, oh, jeez, I'm so sorry. I just, every time that I think about that scene, in the past when he was a boy, and I didn't notice this until I rewatched it, and then when I noticed it, I was like, I'm gonna start crying. I mean, that's what I thought then, but also what's happening now. The boat was getting away from him, whereas in this scene where the boats are in the background, you are seeing he's not only keeping up with them, he's even going past them. And they could have just had him run. You know what I mean? Like, that's why this show is always going to be something that I am so appreciative of, and that I am so complimentary toward. And it's not to say there are no criticisms or that anybody is invalid for having reasons why certain things don't work for them. But I am always going to be very open about why I think this show is so great, because of these sorts of details. Like I said, they could have just had him run. They could have had him just use the advancements that he discovered, and then he tests it out and he's able to do it, and that's that. But the parallels to when he's young, and the amount of screen time that Victor gets isn't that much, but you just feel so strongly for this. He just wants to not only live, but he wants to be able to have a body that really operates in the same terms as his mind. And that scene with the boats always, always, always gets me. It is so well done. In the scene analysis, I go a little bit more in depth about the way in which the music sort of matches, the difference between how the music goes in the past versus what the music does here in the present. But to have this elation in this moment and this almost feeling of triumph, only for it to immediately be squashed by Sky dying. It's the worst. I was just saying I'm willing to compliment the show, but also what the heck? It's so upsetting when that happens, because you're like, no, why? Because she's so cute. I don't know if I've taken the time, because she's barely on the screen, and I didn't want to maybe give away anything for anybody that was only just watching the show for the first time, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. But there's the whole moment where there is that whole thing on Progress Day, and you see Victor backstage, and she's kind of like, hi, and she just like sort of makes a little like face, and you're like, oh, I think she likes him. And then you see like they knew each other when they were kids, and then you catch glimpses of her like obviously having such a crush on him, and it's so cute and innocent and sweet. And then when she's coming up and she's like holding her stuff, and she's like, I just think you're brilliant, and she's talking through like, how do I open up to him about how much I admire him, and then she tries to save him. It's the worst. I hate that scene. I mean, it's great. It's well done, but I hate it also. Sticking with Victor for just a little bit longer, I do want to note that Victor is a character who I think similar to Jace when he was hearing Heimerdinger say, destroy it, you don't understand, it can cause so much harm. They're like, okay, but also it could do a lot of good, so whatever, I'm gonna keep looking at this technology. I think that Victor, I've stated before, is somebody who is willing to put himself in harm's way, but he absolutely has a certain line at this point that he doesn't want to cross. We will see what transpires in the future, but he has a line he's not willing to cross, and that line is other people's well-being. As soon as this event happens with Sky, he is devastated. He has so much guilt, but also he very quickly tells Jace, we need to get rid of it. We need to destroy it. He doesn't even explain. He doesn't say it. He's just like, we need to get rid of it, because he now recognizes it only took one person for him to realize, oh, this can cause harm. That's not okay with me. I also really appreciate that you see him push back against the idea of there being any means of developing the technology into weapons. He's very adamant about, no, absolutely not. That is not what we're going to use this for. And I think that is a great segue into some other characters and their way of looking at the technological advancements of Piltover, and that would be Mel and her mother. Her mother is, first off, so incredibly well voiced. All of the voice actors in the show are great, but the amount of life that this character has and the way in which this performance is done is so good. But immediately, I think you have this shift of like, oh, okay, so Mel's not that bad. When you see where she's, what she had to endure as a child, what her mother made her witness, and how her mother treated her. I mean, you get glimpses of this when she's talking to Jace, and she tells him, like, oh, my mother, well, I don't know if she says mother, but she talks about how her family, they didn't think much of her, and Jace is like, no, you're fantastic. I don't believe that for a second. And she's like, oh, that's okay. But regardless, you actually now finally see what she has had to have hanging over her for so long, and why she has maybe more of a cutthroat instinct is what you think initially. Like, she's just somebody who's willing to manipulate, and at first the idea is like she just wants to get whatever she can from the situation. But then when you see the way her mother is, not only do you realize like, oh, it's not an instinct, it's something that was built into her, but you also recognize now she sees what can happen. She understands where things can go once they reach a certain point, and she's in her own way trying to do everything she can, and you think maybe probably genuinely, to protect her city. And that's how she refers to it when she's talking to her mother, like, get out of my city. You realize a lot of her actions is not out of selfish gain that she is doing the things that she's doing. In a way, it's because she genuinely is trying to protect. With the way that this season ends, with Jinx doing what she does, and you not really knowing what happened with the council and who did or did not make it, I think that a fair statement is that Mel's mother, one, is very ruthless, and two, cared about her daughter. So if anything, even if it was just the threat and Mel is physically perfectly fine, if anything, though, were to have happened, or the threat of something having happened to Mel is made known, which of course it's gonna be, I think pretty much firing a weapon at that council is a sure way to do it. This woman is gonna do everything she can. I mean, I think we're looking at some of Jace's actions and thinking, Jace, like, maybe think about how it looks to cut them off from Piltover and some of your actions. But then I think that's going to look like nothing once she has more control. Obviously, there's going to be a power vacuum. She's a force to be reckoned with. I think she is going to immediately do what she can. And I think if Jace is around, she's going to be manipulating him. If he's not around, she's gonna do whatever she's gonna do. But I am very curious to see what happens with her, especially because you hear her talk about to Mel's brother, and she talks about how your brother crossed a powerful man. So something transpired with one of her other children. To have something once again transpire with one of her children, I think that she is pretty much going to be unleashed. Speaking of people being unleashed, we have the moment where Jace and Vi team up, of all characters to come together. There's these two. They end up doing what they can to try and take out Silco, and specifically Shimmer. I do think initially you watch that scene with a sense of triumph, and also I can only imagine the excitement, because they have been kind of hinting at Jace and his weapon. You actually see the little drawing earlier on. So I think there's a lot of people who are fans of this entire IP that are probably like loving the moment where you finally get to see Vi with her weapon and him with his. But while there is sort of this sense of excitement and this feeling of like, all right, yeah, let's go, also, it quickly ends up becoming devastating, similar to what we end up seeing with Victor and Skye. But I do want to note that while I love Vi, and she is one of my favorite characters, there are some interactions with her and Jace that I think showcase something important and notable, and then there are other things that show one of her probably worst moments. When her and Caitlin go to make this sort of presentation to the council, the council's like, well, maybe we should talk. And Vi's like, are you serious? And then she gets upset and she leaves. And that's not the moment I'm talking about, but even that's maybe not her best moment. She's getting riled up very quickly, and she has a short fuse, and she's impatient, and she's not having any of it. She essentially also sort of decides with Caitlin, like, yeah, that's it, I tried, that's it, I'm done. And she walks away. She does approach Jace, though, and she's like, I saw something in you, which is hilarious a little bit, because it's like, well, yeah, everybody does. It's so easy to convince him to do stuff. But anyway, so she tells him, like, you're the only one that was making sense. But when she first shows up, Jace is like, I'll have you thrown in prison. And there's a line where she says something to the effect of, have you ever been there? Do you know what it's like? And he's like, no. And sorry, that's not what it's not that different from what he sounds like, but that's not actually what he sounds like. But he's basically like, no, I don't. And she's like, yeah, well, maybe don't make threats when you don't know the full extent of what they entail. I do really love that moment. And then I, like many people, I think get kind of sucked into the excitement and the hype of these two joining together to try to take out Silco's Shimmer Factory, I'll call it. And then there's the death of that child. And this is where we get to Vi, I think, her worst moment, or one of her worst moments, which is when Jace is like, what have I done? And he sees this boy. And it is really sad. I mean, obviously, that wasn't what they were there to do. But Vi goes up to him and she tells him he knew what he signed up for. And a little bit, you're like, Vi, no, shame on you a little bit. If anybody understands that everybody within Zaun is just doing what they have to do, especially the children, you should recognize that that kid had no control. He didn't know what he was doing. He was extremely young, and he was just trying to be safe, and he did not deserve that situation whatsoever. It's not that she's saying, like, oh, he deserved this, but in trying to console Jace and to try to convince him that this is what needed to be done, and even though it's sad and awful, basically like, well, get over it, that's what this is like, I think she has one of her worst, ugliest moments. This is followed by a moment that I think is much bigger than just these two characters, where understandably, Jace is feeling terrible about what has happened. He is saying, like, what do I even do? What do I do with this body? Do I just leave it here? And he ends up finally deciding, I'm done. I can't be a part of this. And Vi tells him, you've always been a part of this. You're just finally having to look at it. That's very powerful because, one, it's true, but two, him deciding I don't want to be a part of this anymore, I think that fully captures the differences between Jace's life and Vi's. For Jace, he gets to walk away anytime he wants, whereas this is the reality for everybody living in the Undercity always. They don't get to leave And even when they want to leave and when they try to get out, when they try to make their life a little bit better, you have Jace through his attempts at trying to keep people safe. He ends up blocking them from even being able to get into Piltover. He's done many things that he doesn't realize have had negative consequences. But when he's decided, like, oh, I don't want to anymore, that's the luxury of his life, is he gets to walk away from it. Just goes to show that what that does, that one single moment, the amount of remorse that Jace feels in that moment, he gets to detach himself from it. And the people of the Undercity do not. And it's not that they just don't get to, it's that it's going to repeat for them over and over and over again. And I find for so many individuals, I think part of why Arcane is so powerful, anybody who has ever been in a situation that they don't get to walk away from, when somebody comes to them and offers to help, and they only offer to help so long as it's convenient to them, and then they walk away from it, that is so many people's experiences, and I can only imagine what that scene is like for so many people. But once again, it does showcase flawed people, both Jace and Vi. To repeat myself, they have some of their worst moments. I do ultimately think that this situation is what then leads Jace to decide, let's just go ahead and take a gamble on Silco and give him what he wants, because I want this to be over. And you can understand what would push him to do that, but also he, as Silco accurately notes, it's very easy to basically have him as a mark. He's not somebody who is willing to look at everything in the long run. He doesn't want to try and actually compromise. He just wants everything to be done with and over with, which is why I think Jace and Heimerdinger in particular, why Heimerdinger kind of constantly being like, we need time, we need to wait, and Jace wanting to take action now. I feel like they are both sort of extremes, and if only the two of them could have been able to compromise more, I think that it would have resulted in things working out a lot better. Obviously, we do see Heimerdinger has made his way to Zaun, and we're seeing him finding Echo, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how things play out with those two characters. I'm very curious to know, obviously, of course, like everybody else, who made it out of the council. Is Caitlyn's mom okay? Has something happened with her? Because you can very much imagine that what I talked about with Mel's mother, Caitlyn is going to probably be so furious, and this is going to really further establish that she is going to see Jinx as an enemy. There's just so many repercussions to everything about the end of this, while simultaneously having this be such a fantastic conclusion to so many of the characters' arcs. And I think that's one of the most difficult things to accomplish with a cliffhanger ending, is to have it be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is how this entire season ends. That's it. But then simultaneously having, as I noted, you have this amazing full circle moment with Silco and Vander. You're seeing that this fight, it's not even close to ending. If anything, it's probably going to get worse before it gets better between the Undercity and Piltover. You're also seeing the ways in which the hopes that we saw from Victor and Jace have been sort of squashed, and they have to rework what their values even are. There's just so many arcs that have been so well done. And then also an extreme cliffhanger, and then we'll get our second half. I know there are so many other additional details that I probably didn't get into or give enough time to, but I could go on and on and on about this show. I think for, out of respect for your time, I'm going to go ahead and end things here, as I think kind of looking at the end of the show and the ends of arcs and this cliffhanger is a good stopping point. But I am so excited for season 2. I'm very nervous for season 2. There is one thing that I really hope is not accurate, but I have such a fear, because I didn't touch too much on Echo and Vi's reunion, which was beautiful and lovely. Caitlyn interacting with Echo and her somewhat naively but sweetly trying to see him where he is, be like, I totally understand if you don't want to turn the hex gem over, but also I think that could be a show of good faith if you did. And I think there are wonderful moments within that. But there's one particular thing that I hope that my fear about this thing is not accurate, which is when he shows Vi the mural and he says, these are all the people that we have lost. And you see Vander, which I already have fears about Vander and the whole Hound of the Underground thing. But anyway, so you see Vander on the mural, and you see Powder, and you see Vi as well. There's a part of me that's like, I understand conceptually that they didn't know what happened to Vi, and with Powder, it's like, we've lost Powder, she's Jinx now, because they know that Jinx is alive. But they still have Powder on this wall, and then you see their friends on the mural as well. But there's a part of me that's like, I cannot have that be foreshadowing. I cannot have both Jinx and Vi somehow both end up dying in season 2, and then you see this mural again, and then now it's like fully realized that we did truly lose those two. I'm like, no, I can't. That better not be what happens. I'm really scared to see what ends up, because I'm sure something is going to happen that is somewhat related to this mural, but also related to this wonderful sort of haven that Echo's created. Echo is a character that I really hope we get a lot more of in season 2. He is somebody, as I stated before, he's taken his pain and he's turned it into something so beautiful and so hopeful and also so resilient, and his innovations are truly actually making people's lives better. So I am curious to see him with Heimerdinger. I am wondering also if Victor is alive. Is there now then, because I know that we're going to have this story end after season 2, but I'm like, okay, if not within season 2, then in the future, is there going to be something with like Echo and Victor and like Heimerdinger? Because I do feel like there are some parallels between their paths and their goals and what they were working toward. But anyway, I said we would have a stopping point, and then I kind of segued into talking more. But that is it for a look at Arcane episodes 7 through 9. I can't wait to watch season 2. Thanks so much to anybody who watched this video. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.